Hi everyone and welcome back to Coachy TV. This is the second part of a video series on aerobic power or VO2 max type workouts. We're going to talk about actually the workout design in this video. If you missed our video on the science behind this type of workout, I would click on the link in the very top of the description below to look at that video first. I'm Kyle Giacono. I'm the head boys cross country and track coach at Wharton High School in Tampa, Florida, and I have been for the last 6 years. My credentials are on the screen if you'd like to take a look. So let's get right into it. Aerobic power type workouts. First off, I would not do more than one of these per microcycle. Even if you have a longer microcycle of like 11 or 12 weeks, I really would only do one of these because these are so high intensity type work. The only exception is going to be at the very, very end here when we talk about how races play into training aerobic power. And make sure that you're really thinking about your particular athlete and the part of the training year that they're in. If they're younger, lesser trained kids, if you're trying to peak a particular kid for maybe your district meet versus your state meet, depending on what level they're on, you really want to take a look at all these things because it's really going to alter what type is going to make the most sense for your kid at that point in time. All of these types of workouts need to start with a very good, complete warm-up. This is high-intensity stuff. It's the highest aerobic pace that you can actually handle. So you're probably going to have some kind of continuous run. Your drills, your strides, they really need to be ready to go on these days because these are such high intensity. So the first type and the most well-known type are intervals. These are typically done early or mid-season. The idea being is you've tested their VO2 max and you can hold VO2 max pace for 2 miles continuous, but this type of workout allows you to really increase the amount of meters that you can run each day at this intensity. And that's why you're looking to do these type of workouts more early and mid-season. It's about giving them a lot more volume of this intensity and then allowing them to use that later on in the season as you move their VO2 max. So as I just mentioned, intervals allow you to increase the total load for the day. Now, an interval is actually the rest period in between these bouts of works that we're about to talk about, okay? The actual time on is the actual rep, or however you want to refer to it, but this is actually the rest period in between. So if you hear me refer to it as such, that's why I'm calling it the rest period. So basically, you're going to have bouts of work of 800 to 1600 meters for these types of intervals. You really don't want to go less than 800 meters unless you have a kid that's really, really new or lesser trained, and maybe their pace is just going to mean that maybe a 600 would be, 2 or 2.5 minutes. But for the most part, you really need continuous time at this intensity because that forces your body to really realize that, oh no, we're at maximum oxygen use, and I've got to do something to create the ability to extract more oxygen out of the blood that it's being given to their working muscles. And anything less than 800 meters, and you're probably not getting that. Unless you have, again, a lesser trained kid where a 600 might work. So, all of this work needs to be done at their current aerobic power range, which is 98 to 102%. Again, right at their current aerobic maximum. Anything less than that, and they're just not going to be working hard enough to force their body into that maximum oxygen ability to extract all the oxygen they can out of the blood cells. Anything more than that, and they're going to be increasing the amount of acid in their muscles. And the problem with that is some of those muscles are going to shut down, and for that reason, they're also not going to be forced to extract the most oxygen. These are some of the things we talk about in detail in the science-based part 1 of this video series if you didn't see it. So let's just say that we've got a kid and they run 1030 in their VO2 max test. That would mean that they have an aerobic power range. This is 98 to 102% of 515, which is 1030, 508 to 521. You would give them 800s at 233 to 240, and that's a really good, maybe very beginning of the season type of introduction to this type of workout, but you could also start them right at thousands. I typically do with my more distance kids, 311 to 319, 1200s, 350 to 4, and then 1600s, 508 to 521, as we just mentioned. Typically for this, maybe the first 1 or 2 to 3 week periods in between your test runs, you're probably going to start maybe with, again, thousands or 1200s. Maybe your more mid-distance kids, you start in this 800 meter range and give them maybe 6 to 7 of them. And then you're going to want to build up to this relatively quickly while their intensity is still low. If we're to say this is maybe a high school boy that maybe you're expecting to be under 930 by the end of the season, you need to give them a lot of work at this area early so that later on you can really use these adaptations that you're building. Something that's very important with these types of workouts is that the rest, the interval period, needs to equal the work or their time on. So for this kid, you're probably going to give them about 5:15 off, something like that. But you may also have like 2 or 3 kids that are running fairly similar paces, maybe as like 5:15 to 5:30, something like that. It'd be perfectly okay to give this kid like 5:30 off and start all those kids together. You'd rather it be just slightly more rest than slightly less rest because you need them to maintain this intensity. You don't want the first 1 or 2 to be 5:10 and then all of a sudden you decide, I'm going to give them a little bit less rest on this one to see how they handle it, and then they blow up to a 5:30, 5:35. They're not getting the training. So equal rest to work. And if you have to err on the side of it, give them maybe a few more seconds. Just don't go crazy with it and give them maybe 7 minutes off for a 5-minute rep. Make sure you're using active recoveries on these, and what I mean by that is on their rest interval, have them just do a real easy jog around the track. It can be 10-minute pace, 12-minute pace, something like that. Their heart rate is going to be high enough to where they're still going to be getting some easy aerobic work. In the first video, we talked about the limiting factor on these days at this intensity is going to be the accumulation of acid, and this active recovery is the really cool thing is that the easy aerobic systems use the acid created at this intensity for its own work. So the active recovery is actually going to give them better reps later on. They're going to be able to maintain this high intensity for longer. They may not believe it early, but if you give this to them maybe for a couple weeks and then all of a sudden have them do some static rest where they just stand there, they'll be begging you to let them move. They're going to want to have an active recovery. So that's really important. And this is also going to give them a little bit more aerobic continuous work, because if you do a 1600 and then have them jog for 5 minutes and then hit the next one, they're basically getting continuous running here too. So they're going to get some more of that development that they get more for their easy type long runs. One other thing, when you're setting these up, it is perfectly okay to have a lesser trained kid maybe running at an intensity. Maybe their 1200s are actually like 5 to 5:30. You can have your lesser trained kids running 1200s. It's probably going to be similar time on as maybe your top kids running 1600s or however you're going to do this. Sometimes when I start out, I'll have my lesser trained kids or my middle distance kids with less aerobic development running maybe 7 times 800, while my top kids are going to maybe running 6 times 1000. And it relatively works out to where they're starting most of them somewhat close together. So let's talk about another kind of workout. This is a repetition, and this is done later in the season. The total day's volume is typically less than on an interval. Interval workouts are done early where you're trying to just get volume in at this intensity. Repetitions is to maintain and just barely tweak the fitness levels up when they're already in really good shape toward the season end. The bouts of work are still between 800 and 1600 meters, but they're typically on the longer side. So maybe earlier on in the season you're going to do maybe 5 times 1200s. Later on in the season, you might do 2 times 1600. Just enough to give them a good amount of this work to maintain and maybe just creep up their VO2 max as it's later in the season. You're still going to be at 98 to 102% of their current VO2 max, but while the percentages have stayed the same, typically these paces are going to be faster because they're done at their top fitness level. Their VO2 max has been better. They've done better test runs. Maybe they've done a couple of races that we'll talk about here later, and you've really moved up the intensity. So the volume's going to be a little bit less, but the actual intensity will be higher. And on these, the real discerning difference, not only that there's going to be less total work for the day, is the fact that the rest is going to be longer than the work. So let's say that you have this kid, maybe they're running 5-minute flat or 450 to 5 minutes. You're probably going to want to give them 8 to 10 minutes in between. The active recovery should still be used, but for about the first 5-ish minutes. After that, and the active recovery is really just for aerobic reasons, you've gotten most of the acid out of them at that point, so you don't have to maybe run for 10 continuous minutes as a recovery jog. 5 to 6 minutes will probably get the job done, and then they can hit the next repetition at a very, very high intensity. So maybe you could do like 4 times thousands. I've done at this, maybe 3 times 1200s, 2 times miles. Those are all really good examples of repetition style workouts. So, continuing to look at some workout types, VO2 Max tests are fantastic VO2 Max or aerobic power development too. I recommend and this is also a repetition style workout. The best two are right up here, the Ashram protocol, which is the one that I recommend using. I did a whole video on this. It's down in the description about how to do VO2 max testing. 2 miles to exhaustion. VO2 max is basically your 2-mile pace. So running 2 miles as fast as you can is going to give you great development. It may be a little bit less volume, but it's still really good workout for the day. The Birchford protocol is 10 minutes. Best distance to exhaustion is very similar to running 2 miles at your best pace. Will give them really good VO2 max development. The VHO protocol, you're probably doing this again more for lesser trained kids to get started, or very, very select few middle distance runners. You're not going to get a lot of VO2 max development that day, but you could get some, but just realize it's not nearly as good as the first two. These tests should be done every 2 to 3 weeks to track their fitness and update intensity. So, as I mentioned before, as they get more and more improved and they move away from intervals and get more to repetitions, the intensity will be higher as their tests indicate they become more aerobically fit. And then, of course, races can also sort of be used for this type of development. Now, the longer ones are definitely better. The 3,200 meter being the absolute best. Most high schools in the United States use 3,200 meters as the longest race. Obviously, in college, it's typically more, if there's this type of distance, it's more of a steeplechase. All of those things can be used for great aerobic development and can be used directly to change their VO2 max test if you just use some of these conversions over here. Now, if we're in cross-country season and they're running 5K, or it's college track and they're running 5K, it can be used for aerobic power development to a point. In the first video, we talked about how the 5K is 97% of your VO2 max, and that's very, very close to being in aerobic power range, but it's a little bit short. So you're probably going to get a little bit of aerobic power development, but just not as much if it was a 3,200 meter. It's just not quite fast enough, but you can get some work. And then the 1,600, it is questionable for the same reason that the VHO protocol is questionable for aerobic power development. You could get by, but you can definitely use it to recalculate their date pace VO2 max, and you certainly should. Every time you have a kid run one of these 3 races, you should go and reconvert their VO2 max to see if they've set a new level of fitness so you can update their interval and repetition workout intensities. The only ones of these that you can double up with is you could do a race and an interval in the same microcycle. Probably earlier on you're going to be doing these. Later on you could do repetitions and a 3,200 meter 5K or 1,600 meter, and you could do a test in one of these races. They're very similar. Just make sure that it makes sense, that you're not doing these very, very close together, because aerobic power workouts are very, very draining. All right, so some look-fors and danger points here. Total distance for a high school kid should be, for intervals, 3,200 meters to 9,600 meters. I suggest about 6,400 meters. Those are 4 times miles. That's a great, great place for aerobic power development for a high school kid. You have maybe a lesser trained kid. 3,200 meters, remember, is going to be the test distance. You could do like 4 times 800 for a lesser trained kid. That kid probably got the VHO protocol, though, a mile VO2 max test, and you're using this just to kind of get them a little bit closer here in the middle. You could do 4 times 1,000 maybe for a lesser trained kid, maybe 3 times 1,200. Getting up to 9,600 meters is asking a lot. You're probably doing that early in the season if you're going to do something like that before they have any races. You can do these in sets intervals where maybe you do 3 times mile, give them a slightly longer break, and then do 2 times mile or 3 times 1,000, something like that, and get the mileage up a little bit that way. So you could also do them in sets and get a little bit more volume early on. For repetitions, typically you're going to equal around 3,200 meters. As I mentioned, this is probably going to be 2 times mile, maybe 3 times thousands, 4 times 800s. For later in the season, as you're just trying to maintain and just barely nudge fitness up a little bit. They must be in the zone for this workout to work. They have to be right at their maximum oxygen use in order for the body to realize, I don't have enough myoglobin in the muscles. This is what pulls the oxygen out of your blood and into the working muscles for increased O2 extraction benefits. It's better to have all of these reps be in the zone? For a hypothetical kid, I would suggest the kid that's from 521 to 508, I would tell if I had that kid to target 520 for the first 2 reps and then try and bring it down from there, as opposed to trying to run 508 for the first 2 and maybe they regress down to like 525 afterwards. You only really got the development you wanted on the first 2. The last 2 just fell off too much for really to get the development that you want. The average might be there, but it's better to have all the reps be in the zone. And it's better to give a little bit more time off to keep things in the zone within reason. Again, if you have a kid that's maybe targeting 515, you can give them 530 to keep everybody in the zone. Just don't go crazy and start giving them 6 to 7 minutes on an interval unless you're doing repetitions, in which case you do want some more volume or more rest in between the rest interval. Heat's a huge factor on these days. This is maximum oxygen use, and if you start giving them a super, super hot day underneath the sun, this workout is going to regress big time, and you're not going to get what you want. Try to have these on the cooler parts of the week or time of day. I'm fortunate enough at our school, we don't start till 8:30, so we can get a full AP-style workout done before the school day, and they can shower. Some of them even can go home and get shower if they live close enough and be back in time for the school day. You can also do them on days off from school, on a Monday or a Friday when you get an extra day there, you can train them early, or on weekends you can do all that too. Just make sure that the heat is not limiting them. These workouts are very, very high intensity and require adequate recovery. You got to give them an easy run the day after. There's just no two ways about it. This is so high intensity. At least 48 hours. So you got to give them an easy day before you come back with something else, and you would never come back with this 2 days after. Maybe you're going to give them a tempo run or something else like a hill workout. I'll explain in some future videos here, but 48 hours is the minimum. If you go all the way out to 9,600 meters, you may even need to give them more than this. This is very, very high intensity work, and they need to have some recovery if you really want them to have the proper adaptations. So some key takeaway points here. VO2 max has been shown to increase between 5 and 20% in college-age men and women following 8 to 12 weeks of training. So over time, it gets better. And this is why you really want to, in that early part of the season, give them a lot of this work so they can use it later on when they really need it. And VO2 max is considered by most exercise physiologists to be the single most accurate measure of endurance fitness. This is their best aerobic pace. And it's really, I'll do a whole workout video, our whole series of videos on win predictors, and VO2 max plays a huge factor in who wins every race from the 800 up to the 5K. 10K it starts to shift a little bit, but it's still a really good measure of aerobic fitness. But it has to be, these workouts have to be at 98 to 102. 95, it isn't fast enough. 105, and their muscles are going to shut down. It's a very narrow window, and you have to do a great job of really articulating that to your kids and do a really good job of setting up these paces for them. Don't ask for more. This is their maximum on this date based on their testing, and you have to let them train at this intensity beforehand. If their easy days are truly at aerobic threshold, these easy pace workouts that I talk about in some prior videos I've posted, runners should have the adequate fuel, the stored glucose or glycogen. They should have the aerobic development from the long runs, and they should be rested from these easy days to complete these at the prescribed intensities. Their tests say they should be able to run 98 to 102. If they can't, something else is going on here. Maybe their long runs are too fast, they're not sleeping, maybe they're not giving the effort on this day. Something's off, because they should be able to run those intensities for those types of volumes. Their test said so. Be smart about the time and distance you're giving them. It's more about time in the zone versus true distance. Again, a lesser trained kid running a 1200 might be the exact same time on as a 1600. But you take that lesser trained kid and try and get them to do mile repeats at maybe like 6 or 7 minutes, they're going to regress because that's so much continuous time in the zone. So make sure that you're being smart about that. And younger and lesser trained kids are going to be much more affected by acid. Acid is the limiting factor on these days, so they may need shorter reps and less total volume for the day. Maybe closer to 3,200 meters to start, and then build them up to maybe 4,000, 5,000 meters. Add volume with a long cooldown. I'm always an advocate of this on hard days. Going 3 to 4 miles at aerobic threshold or easy pace heart rate afterwards. You have aerobic threshold workouts hopefully set up from doing VO2 max testing. If you missed those videos, they're in the description down below. 120 to 150 heart rate. It's going to be less pace because of how much hard work they did on that day. And they'll be able to get some good aerobic development too to keep the volume high, but also these long cooldowns are going to help clear any accumulated acid that they've developed from the workout. That's the limiting factor on these days. I used to, 3-4 years ago, have my kids ice for 10 minutes afterwards, and it just took so much time, and they were still somewhat sore afterwards. The last year or two, I've gone to these 3 to 4 mile cooldowns afterwards. The aerobic system uses the acid for its own respiration. You're getting it out of your system. And so not only are they going to be sore and less sore and better ready to go the next day, they're going to get some good aerobic development on these days too. If you found this video helpful, please consider liking and subscribing or asking some questions, comments down below. I'm going to do a video series again on the importance of aerobic power or VO2 max on different types of races in the next day or two, so look out for those. Until next time, this has been Coachy TV.